Hello there, boys and girls, and welcome back to Little House Story Corner, and welcome to the Little House on the Prairie reading collection, where we are going to be reading excerpts from the book series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura was a little girl who lived a long time ago, before cell phones, before big grocery stores, and before televisions. So today our reading will be excerpts part 1 of Little House in the Big Woods, where we are going to learn all about how Laura and her ma and pa and sister all prepared for the long, cold winter ahead. Because they didn't have big grocery stores, and some towns didn't even have little shops where they could get food, they had to grow and hunt all of their own food and prepare so that they were warm and fed all winter long. So here we go. Once upon a time, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin, in a little gray house made of logs. The great dark trees of the big woods stood all around the house, and beyond them were other trees, and beyond them were more trees, as far as a man could go to the north in a day, or a week, or a whole month. There was nothing but woods. There were no houses. There were no roads. There were no people. There were only trees and the wild animals who had their homes among them. Wolves lived in the big woods, and bears and huge wildcats. Muskrats and mink and otter lived by the streams. Foxes had dens in the hills, and deer roamed everywhere. To the east of the little log house and to the west, there were miles and miles of trees, and only a few little log houses scattered far apart in the edge of the big woods. So far as the little girl could see, there was only the one little house where she lived with her father and mother, her sister Mary, and baby sister Carrie. A wagon track ran before the house, turning and twisting out of sight in the woods where the wild animals lived. But the little girl did not know where it went, nor what might be at the end of it. The little girl was named Laura, and she called her father Pa and her mother Ma. In those days and in that place, children did not say father and mother or mama and papa as they do now. At night, when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, she listened and could not hear anything at all but the sound of the trees whispering together. Sometimes far away in the night, a wolf howled. Then he came nearer and howled again. It was a scary sound. Laura knew that wolves could eat little girls, but she was safe inside the solid log walls. Her father's gun hung over the door, and good old Jack, the brindle bulldog, lay on guard before it. Her father would say, "Go to sleep, Laura. Jack won't let the wolves come in." So Laura snuggled under the covers of the trundle bed close beside Mary and went to sleep. One night, her father picked her up out of bed and carried her to the window so that she might see the wolves. There were 2 of them sitting in front of the house. They looked like shaggy dogs. They pointed their noses at the big, bright moon and howled. Jack paced up and down before the door, growling. The hair stood up along his back, and he showed his sharp, fierce teeth to the wolves. They howled, but they could not get in. The house was a comfortable house. Upstairs there was a large attic, pleasant to play in when the rain drummed on the roof. Downstairs was the small bedroom and a big room. The bedroom had a window that closed with a wooden shutter. The big room had 2 windows with glass in the panes, and it had 2 doors, a front door and a back door. There was a crooked rail fence to keep the bears and the deer away. On that particular day, Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary had fresh venison for dinner. It was so good that Laura wished she could eat it all, but most of the meat had to be salted and smoked and packed away to be eaten in the winter. For winter was coming. The days were shorter, and frost crawled up the window panes at night. Soon the snow would come. Then the log house would be almost buried in snowdrifts, and the lake and the streams would freeze. In the bitter cold weather, Pa could not be sure of finding any wild game for meat. The bears would be hidden away in their dens where they slept soundly all winter long. The squirrels would be curled in their nests in hollow trees with their furry tails wrapped snugly around their noses. The deer and the rabbits would be shy and swift. Even if Pa could get a deer, it would be thin, not fat and plump as deer are in the fall. Pa might hunt alone all day in the bitter cold, in the big woods covered with snow, and come home at night with nothing for Ma and Mary and Laura to eat. So as much food as possible must be stored away in the little house before winter came. Standing on end in the yard was a tall length cut from the trunk of a big hollow tree. Pa had driven nails inside as far as he could reach from each end. Then he stood it up, put a little roof over the top, and cut a little door on one side near the bottom. On the piece that he cut out, he fastened leather hinges and he fitted it into place. And that was the little door with the bark still on it. After the deer meat had been salted several days, Pa cut a hole near the end of each piece and put a string through it. Laura watched him do this, and then she watched him hang the meat on the nails in the hollow log. He reached up through the little door and hung it on the nails, as far up as he could reach. Then he put a ladder against the log, climbed up to the top, moved the roof to one side, and reached down inside to hang the meat on the nails. Then Pa put the roof back again, climbed down the ladder, and said to Laura,
"Run over to the chopping block and fetch me some of those green hickory chips. New, clean, white ones."
So Laura ran to the block where Pa chopped wood and filled her apron with the fresh, sweet-smelling chips. Just inside the little door in the hollow log, Pa built a fire of tiny bits of bark and moss, where he laid some of the chips on it very carefully. Instead of burning quickly, the green chips smoldered and filled the hollow log with thick, choking smoke. Pa shut the door, and a little smoke squeezed through the crack around it, and a little smoke came out through the roof, but most of it was shut in with the meat.
"There's nothing better than good hickory smoke,"
Pa said. "That will make good venison that will keep anywhere, in any weather." Then he took his gun and his slinging axe on his shoulder, and he went away to the clearing to cut down some more trees. Laura and Ma watched the fire for several days. When smoke stopped coming through the cracks, Laura would bring more hickory chips, and Ma would put them on the fire under the meat. All the time there was a little smell of smoke in the yard, and when the door was opened, a thick, smoky, meaty smell came out. At last, Pa said the venison had smoked long enough. Then they let the fire go out, and Pa took all the strips and pieces of meat out of the hollow tree. Ma wrapped each piece neatly in paper and hung them in the attic, where they would keep safe and dry. One morning, Pa went away before daylight with the horses and wagon, and that night he came home with a wagon load of fish. The big wagon box was piled full, and some of the fish were as big as Laura. Pa had gone to Lake Pepin and caught them all with a net. Ma cut large slices of flaky white fish without one bone for Laura and Mary. They all feasted on the good fresh fish. All that they did not eat fresh was salted down in barrels for the winter. The garden behind the little house had been growing all summer. It was so near the house that the deer did not jump the fence and eat the vegetables in the daytime, and at night Jack kept them away. Sometimes in the morning there were little hoof prints among the carrots and the cabbages, but Jack's tracks were there too, and the deer had jumped right out again. Now the potatoes and carrots and beets and turnips and cabbages were gathered and stored in the cellar for freezing nights had come. Onions were made into long ropes braided together by their tops, and then were hung in the attic beside wreaths of red peppers strung on threads. The pumpkins and the squashes were piled in orange and yellow and green heaps in the attic's corners. The barrels of salted fish were in the pantry, and yellow cheeses were stacked on pantry shelves. At this point, the little house was fairly bursting, with good food stored away for the long winter ahead. The pantry and the shed and the cellar were full, and so was the attic. Laura and Mary must play in the house now, for it was cold outside, and the brown leaves were all falling from the trees. The fire in the cook stove never went out. At night, Pa banked it with ashes to keep the coals alive till morning. The attic was a lovely place to play. The large, round, colored pumpkins made beautiful chairs and tables. The red peppers and the onions dangled overhead. The hams and the venison hung in their paper wrappings, and all the bunches of dried herbs, the spicy herbs for cooking, and the bitter herbs for medicine gave the place a dusty, spicy smell. Often the wind howled outside with a cold and lonesome sound. But in the attic, Laura and Mary played house with the squashes and pumpkins, and everything was snug and cozy. Mary was bigger than Laura, and she had a rag doll named Nettie. Laura had only a corn cob wrapped in a handkerchief, but it was a good doll. It was named Susan. It wasn't Susan's fault that she was only a corn cob. Sometimes Mary let Laura hold Nettie, but she did it only when Susan couldn't see. The best of times were at night. After supper, Pa brought his traps in from the shed to grease them by the fire. He rubbed them bright and greased the hinges of the jaws and the springs of the pans with a feather dipped in bear grease. While he greased the traps, Pa told Laura and Mary little jokes and stories, and afterward he would play his fiddle. The doors and windows were tightly shut, and the cracks of the window frames stuffed with cloth to keep out the cold. But Black Susan, the cat, came and went as she pleased, day and night through the swinging door of the cat hole in the bottom of the front door. She always went very quickly, so the door would not catch her tail when it fell shut behind her. One night, when Pa was greasing the traps, he watched Black Susan come in and he said,
There was once a man who had 2 cats, a big cat and a little cat.
Laura and Mary ran to lean on his knees and hear the rest.
He had 2 cats,
Pa repeated.
a big cat and a little cat. So he made a big cat hole in his door for the big cat, and then he made a little cat hole for the little cat.
There Pa stopped. But why couldn't the little cat? Mary began. Because the big cat wouldn't let it, Laura interrupted.
Laura, that is very rude. You must never interrupt,
said Pa.
But I see,
He said,
that either one of you has more sense than the man who cut the 2 cat holes in his door.
There he laid away the traps, and he took his fiddle out of the box, and he began to play. That was the best time of all. The first snow came to the little house and the bitter cold. Every morning Pa took his gun and his traps and was gone all day in the big woods. The snow kept coming till it was drifted and banked against the house. In the mornings, the window panes were covered with frost and beautiful pictures of trees and flowers and fairies. Laura and Mary were allowed to take Ma's thimble and make pretty patterns of circles in the frost on the glass. When they put their mouths close to the pane and blew their breath on it, the white frost melted and ran in drops down the glass. Then they could see the drifts of snow outdoors and the great trees standing bare and black, making thin blue shadows on the white snow. Laura and Mary helped Ma with the work. Every morning there were dishes to wipe. Mary wiped more of them than Laura because she was bigger, but Laura always wiped carefully with her own little cup and plate. By the time the dishes were all wiped and set away, the trundle bed was aired. Then, standing one on each side, Laura and Mary straightened the covers, tucked them in well at the foot and the sides, plumped up the pillows, and put them in place. Then Ma pushed the trundle bed into its place under the big bed. After this was done, Ma began the work that belonged to that day. Each day had its own proper work. Ma used to say, wash on Monday, iron Tuesday, mend on Wednesday, churn on Thursday, clean on Friday, bake on Saturday, rest on Sunday. Laura liked the churning and the baking days best of all the week. In winter, the cream was not yellow as it was in summer, and the butter churned from it was white and not so pretty. Ma liked everything on her table to be pretty, so in the wintertime she colored the butter. After she had put the cream in the tall crockery churn and set it near the stove to warm, she washed and scraped a long orange-colored carrot. Then she grated it on the bottom of the old leaky tin pan that Pa had punched full of nail holes for her. Ma rubbed the carrot across the roughness until she had rubbed it all through the holes, and when she lifted up the pan there was a soft, juicy mound of grated carrot. She put this in a little pan of milk on the stove, and when the milk was hot she poured milk and carrot into a cloth bag. Then she squeezed the bright yellow milk into the churn where it colored all the cream. Now the butter would be yellow. Laura and Mary were allowed to eat the carrot after the milk had all been squeezed out. Mary thought she ought to have the larger share because she was older, and Laura said that she should have it because she was littler. But Ma said they must divide it evenly. It was very good. When the cream was ready, Ma scalded the long wooden churn dash, put it in the churn, and dropped the wooden churn cover over it. The churn cover had a little round hole in the middle, and Ma moved the dash up and down through the hole. She churned and churned for a very long time. Mary could sometimes churn while Ma rested, but the dash was too heavy for Laura. At first, the splashes of cream showed thick and smooth around the little hole. After a long time, they began to look grainy. Then Ma churned more slowly, and on the dash there began to appear tiny grains of yellow butter. When Ma took off the churn cover, there was the butter, in a golden lump, drowning in the buttermilk. Then Ma took out the lump with a wooden paddle into a wooden bowl, and she washed it many times in cold water, turning it over and over and working it with the paddle until the water ran clear. After that, she salted it. Now came the best part of the churning. Ma molded the butter. On the loose bottom of the wooden butter mold was carved the picture of a strawberry with 2 strawberry leaves. With the paddle, Ma packed butter tightly into the mold until it was full. Then she turned it upside down over a plate and pushed on the handle of the loose bottom. The little firm pat of golden butter came out with the strawberry and its leaves molded on the top. Laura and Mary watched, breathless, one on each side of Ma, while the golden little butter pats, each with its strawberry on the top, dropped onto the plate as Ma put all the butter through the mold. Then Ma gave them each a drink of good, fresh buttermilk. On Saturdays, when Ma made the bread, they each had a little piece of dough to make into a little loaf. They might have a bit of cookie dough, too, to make little cookies, and once Laura even made a pie in her patty pan. After the day's work was done, Ma sometimes cut paper dolls for them. She cut the dolls out of stiff white paper and drew the faces with a pencil. Then, from bits of colored paper, she cut dresses and hats, ribbons and laces, so that Laura and Mary could dress their dolls beautifully. But the best time of all was at night when Pa came home. He would come in from his trapping through the snowy woods with tiny icicles hanging on the ends of his mustaches. And he would hang his gun on the wall over the door, throw off his fur cap and coat and mittens, and call,
"Where's my little half pint of sweet cider half drunk up?"
That was Laura because she was so small. Laura and Mary would run to climb on his knees and sit there while he warmed himself by the fire. Then he would put on his coat and cap and mittens again and go out to do the chores and bring in plenty of wood for the fire. Sometimes when Pa had walked his trap lines quickly because the traps were empty, or when he had got some good game sooner than usual, he would come home early. Then he would have time to play with Laura and Mary. One game they loved was called Mad Dog. Pa would run his fingers through his thick brown hair, standing it all up on end. Then he dropped on all fours, growling. He chased Laura and Mary all around the room, trying to get them cornered where they couldn't get away. They were quick at dodging and running, but once he caught them against a wooden box behind the stove. They couldn't get past Pa, and there was no other way out. Then Pa growled so terribly, His hair was wild and his eyes so fierce. It all seemed so real. Mary was so frightened that she could not move. But as Pa came nearer, Laura screamed, and with a wild leap and a scramble, she went over the wood box, dragging Mary with her. And at once there was no mad dog at all. There was only Pa, standing there with his blue eyes shining, looking at Laura.
Well,
He said to her,
you're only a little half pint of cider half drunk up, but by jinx, you're as strong as the little French horse.
"You shouldn't frighten the children so, Charles," Ma said. "Look how big their eyes are." Pa looked, and then he took down his fiddle. He began to play and sing. Laura and Mary forgot all about the mad dog. Pa was keeping time with his foot, and Laura clapped her hands to the music as he sang. All alone in the big woods, in the snow and the cold, the little log house was warm and snug and cozy. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and baby Carrie were comfortable and happy there, especially at night. Then the fire was shining on the hearth, the cold and the dark, and the wild beasts were all shut out. And Jack, the brindle bulldog, and Black Susan the cat lay blinking at the flames in the fireplace. Ma sat in her rocking chair sewing by the light of the lamp on the table. The lamp was bright and shiny. There was salt in the bottom of its glass bowl with the kerosene to keep the kerosene from exploding. And there were bits of red flannel among the salt to make it pretty. And it was pretty. Laura loved to look at the lamp with its glass chimney so clean and sparkling, its yellow flame burning so steadily, and its bowl of clear kerosene colored red by the bits of flannel. She loved to look at the fire in the fireplace flickering and changing all the time, burning yellow and red and sometimes green above the logs, and hovering blue over the golden and ruby coals. And then Pa told stories. When Laura and Mary begged him for a story, he would take them on his knees and tickle their faces with his long whiskers until they laughed aloud. His eyes were blue and merry. One night, Pa looked at Black Susan stretching herself before the fire and running her claws out and in, and he said,
Do you know that a panther is a cat? A great, big, wild cat?
No, said Laura.
Well, it is,
said Pa.
Just imagine Black Susan bigger than Jack and fiercer than Jack when he growls. Then she would be just like a panther.
He settled Laura and Mary more comfortably on his knees, and he said,
I'll tell you about Grandpa and the panther.
Your grandpa? Laura asked.
No, Laura, your grandpa, my father.
Oh, Laura said, and she wriggled closer into Pa's arm. She knew her grandpa. He lived far away in the big woods, in a big log house. As Pa told them the story, Laura and Mary shivered and snuggled closer to him. They were safe and snug on his knees, with his strong arms around them. They liked to be there, before the warm fire with Black Susan purring on the hearth and a good dog, Jack, stretched out beside her. When they heard a wolf howl, Jack's head lifted, and his hairs rose stiff along his back. But Laura and Mary listened to that lonely sound in the dark and the cold of the big woods, and they were not afraid. They were cozy and comfortable in their little house made of logs, with the snow drifted around it and the wind crying because it could not get in by the fire. So thank you, boys and girls, so much as always for coming back to Little House Story Corner. I hoped you enjoyed those bits and pieces of part 1 of Little House in the Big Woods, and that you will come back next time for part 2. Interested in listening to any of the other stories from the Little House collection, the Bible series, or the adventures of Zion and Obi, go get an adult in charge to look through our playlist. They can also find some information at ourlittlehouseonthemountain.com. And who knows, they might even subscribe to the channel and like this video. And we wanted to thank our patrons over on the Little House Patreon for making this ad-free and possible. We love you all so much, and God willing, we will see you friends on the next one. See you then. Bye.